Emily's apartment on the edge of town had always been her haven after grueling late shifts at the hospital. Tonight, however, something felt different. The stillness of her apartment seemed unnatural, as if an unseen presence was watching her every move. She tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on her exhaustion, and began to settle in for the night. As the clock struck midnight, her phone rang, startling her in the quiet room. The caller ID read unknown number. She let it ring, thinking it was just a late robocall. But when it rang again seconds later, a sense of unease crept over her. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" she asked tentatively, but there was no response. Only the sound of slow, heavy breathing filled the silence. Her pulse quickened. "Who is this?" she whispered, gripping the phone tighter. After a pause, a faint whisper replied, "Emily." Her name, spoken by a stranger in the dead of night, sent a chill down her spine. She hung up, feeling her heartbeat race as she checked the locks on her doors and windows, but everything was secure. Just as she tried to dismiss the encounter, her phone buzzed with a message. "I see you." Emily froze, staring at the message in horror. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but her apartment was empty. Then her phone rang again. She answered it with a shaking voice. "What do you want?" This time the voice chuckled, a low, menacing sound that seemed to revel in her fear. "I'm closer than you think," it said. Her breath caught as she threw the phone down, backing away. Just then, a knock echoed from the front door, loud and deliberate, each knock rattling through her silent apartment. She crept toward the door, dread building as she looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but her phone buzzed again with a new message. This one contained a photo of her, taken from behind, standing in her own living room. Her blood ran cold as she backed away from the door. Desperate for help, she tried dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. Suddenly, she heard a faint rustling from her bedroom, a sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She picked up a heavy bookend, clutching it tightly as she inched down the hallway toward her room. Her phone buzzed again with another message. "I'm waiting for you, Emily." She stared at the screen in disbelief, then slowly pushed open her bedroom door. The room was dark, but in the shadows, she could make out the closet door, slightly ajar, casting an eerie shadow. As she stepped closer, a scratching sound came from inside the closet. She gathered her courage, flung open the door, and found nothing. Her heartbeat began to slow as she tried to convince herself it was all in her head. But when she turned around, she froze. A figure now stood in her bedroom doorway, tall and cloaked in shadows. Only his eyes, cold and piercing, were visible, watching her with a twisted smile. Emily stumbled backward, holding up the bookend like a weapon. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure tilted his head, his smile widening. "I told you, Emily," he said in a low, mocking tone. "I'm already here." Desperate, Emily ran toward the door, but the figure didn't move. He simply watched her, savoring her fear. She stopped just short of him, clutching her makeshift weapon, trapped and out of options. "You'll never be rid of me," he whispered, stepping closer, his presence filling the room with an unnatural chill. A glint of metal appeared in his hand, a long, thin blade that caught the dim light. Emily backed up, pleading, "Please, just leave me alone." But he only stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. With a last desperate move, she lunged for the light switch, flooding the room with brightness. She blinked, adjusting to the light, but when she looked up, the figure had vanished. She stood there, gasping, trying to catch her breath, but the sense of dread didn't leave. Her phone buzzed one last time. She looked down at it, reading the final message. "Good night, Emily. I'll be seeing you very soon." Emily dropped the phone, her hands shaking. In the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the dark window across the room. But as she looked closer, her reflection seemed off. Her own face was smiling back at her in a twisted, mocking way, a smile that didn't belong to her. Stumbling back, she covered her mouth, horror settling in as the apartment lights flickered and finally went out, plunging her into darkness. The silence returned, broken only by the faint, steady sound of breathing. The next morning, Emily's lifeless body lay on the floor of her apartment, her phone beside her, the screen cracked, and still glowing with the final text message from the unknown number. "See you soon, Emily." The apartment was silent when the police arrived, responding to concerned calls from her neighbors who'd heard faint screams the night before. Officer Markson, a seasoned investigator, led the team, surveying the scene with a grim expression. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the shadows seemed darker, as though they were hiding something sinister. Cause of death appears to be a deep stab wound, Officer Markson murmured to his partner, noting the expression of terror frozen on Emily's face. It looks like she saw her attacker. Markson moved carefully, examining the crime scene. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed Emily's phone. The last message on the screen caught his attention. "Good night, Emily." He frowned, flipping through her recent calls and messages, noting the repeated calls from an unknown number. It was as if whoever had done this had been taunting her, stalking her through her own phone. Just then, he noticed a message notification popping up on the screen. The officers exchanged puzzled glances. No one should be able to message her now. The phone had been inactive since her death. Markson's curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the message. "Hello, officer. I'm still here." Markson stared at the screen, feeling a sudden chill. He glanced around the room, but there was no one there. Yet, the eerie sense of being watched weighed down on him. The message on the phone blinked again. "I see you too, Officer Markson." Markson backed away, unsettled, as a strange, quiet laughter seemed to fill the silence around him. The case file would remain unsolved, marked by the mysterious messages from a killer who seemed to vanish without a trace. As the officers filed out, the phone screen faded to black, the chilling message disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the lingering sense that this wasn't the end.